Hello and welcome to Global News Today, bringing you exclusive interviews with leading experts every weekday here on Al Arabiya News. I'm Tom Burges Watson. Coming up on today's programme, in a high-stakes phone call, President Putin pledges to President Trump that Russia will temporarily stop attacking Ukrainian energy facilities, but he declines to endorse a full 30-day ceasefire. World leaders call for a halt in the hostilities in Gaza and a political solution to the conflict. This is a second day of Israeli strikes on the enclave, kill at least 10 more Palestinians. And two NASA astronauts returned to Earth 9 months after they began what was supposed to be a week-long stay aboard the International Space Station. Hello and welcome to the programme. We begin with the latest on last night's lengthy telephone conversation between the US President Donald Trump and the Russian President Vladimir Putin, during which a number of agreements were reached. Well, President Putin agreed to temporarily halt attacks on Ukrainian energy facilities. He approved a prisoner exchange and agreed to engage in talks about security in the Black Sea. However, the Russian leader declined to endorse a full 30-day ceasefire, which President Trump had hoped would serve as the first step towards a more lasting peace deal. Well, despite that, President Trump, who has had a complicated relationship with the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, spoke positively about his call with his Russian opposite number.
We had a great call. It lasted almost 2 hours. Talked about a lot of things and toward getting it to peace, and we talked about other things also.
President Trump there. Well, when asked if President Putin had demanded an immediate cessation of aid to Ukraine, the US president responded that the issue hadn't been addressed during their telephone conversation.
We didn't talk about aid, actually. We didn't talk about aid at all. We talked about a lot of things, but aid was never discussed.
Well, amidst fears that the United States is shifting its position in favor of Russia, Ukrainians in Kyiv reacted to that telephone conversation between the two leaders, with some believing that President Trump is too lenient on President Putin.
I would like it to happen, freezing strikes on our energy infrastructure, but Russia is not only hitting the energy infrastructure, but also many civilian areas and other targets, while Ukrainians are only targeting Russia's energy facilities. I think that this is a way to take away Ukraine's last leverage, while Russia will be able to hit other targets as well, which is already what they're doing.
Okay, reaction there on the streets of Kyiv. Well, let's get some more analysis. We can speak now to Mick Mulvaney, former Chief of Staff to President Donald Trump, who joins us now from Washington. Mick, great to have you with us once again here on Al Arabiya News. In your opinion, what was achieved during that 2-hour-long telephone conversation?
Well, anytime you can have a 2-hour-long conversation with somebody, it's probably going to be positive in some fashion. My experience in the White House was that the bad conversations got very short, very brief, very quickly. So if you can have that rapport and that dialogue for that length of time, my guess is that by itself is going to have some value. I'm not really sure that Trump expected this, though, Tom. I get the sense from a lot of his dialogue before he won the election, since he's come into office again, from a lot of his body language, that he thought this might be easier, that the Russians might be more interested in drawing a close to hostilities faster than they actually are. So there's a sense of frustration, I think, coming from the White House. Certainly progress was made yesterday, although now we're hearing reports here in Washington this morning, as you and I talked, that the Russians have not abided by the temporary cessation on attacks on energy infrastructure, and that overnight they may have attacked some Ukrainian facilities. That would be a bad sign. But generally speaking, I think there's frustration. Slow progress, slower than they wanted, and that's frustrating to them.
Yeah, so overall, as you're saying, not quite as simple as picking up the telephone and ending the war. And in terms of the essence and what was actually agreed upon, I mean, what you're saying is this all fell rather short of expectations.
I think so. Certainly, if your expectations were that you could have a phone call and figure out a way to get at least a temporary ceasefire, a 30-day deal, then there has to be sort of a disappointment in not being able to get that. What I think is really more interesting to watch is whether or not the Russians will abide by what they said they would do yesterday. Again, there's some indication that they've already reneged on the deal that they had reached with Trump last night. So, look, the Russians are tough negotiators. There's no question. Trump knows that. or at least he should know that. And I think he is finding it a little bit more difficult than he expected.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, within less than 24 hours of that telephone call taking place, we were getting reports from both sides actually accusing each other of violating the new agreement. A little bit of told you so from some European leaders who are saying that President Putin's rejection of that 30-day truce, they say, is proof that Moscow isn't really serious about peace. How does it look to you?
Well, that's been the knock on the Russians from the very beginning, right? Is that they're not trustworthy negotiating partners. I take everything. Look, and I don't mean to demean the European leadership. I spent a lot of time there. I have a lot of friends there, but they don't like Donald Trump very much. They still, I think, in Europe especially, they're still stunned that he won the election. And they're still having to deal with that. So I have to take everything they say with a grain of salt. But I think they probably have a point here, is that, again, if you asked them 3 months ago if it would be easy to negotiate a ceasefire or a cessation of hostilities in Ukraine, they would have said, no, it's very, very difficult. And it turns out that they're closer to being right than people probably wanted them to be in this country.
Some analysts saying that President Putin gave President Trump just enough during that call last night to prevent the talks as being headlined as having been a failure. Do you agree with that?
You could look at it 15 different ways. I know there's a lot of experts who make a living doing exactly what you just described. So having been there, having been on these phone conversations, having been in the White House, if I'm on the phone call yesterday and the chief of staff certainly was listening in, or at least got a transcript afterwards, you're looking for signs of positive momentum. That's what you're looking for, right? Is you're trying to figure out, okay, where can we build on? What good comes from this conversation? A 2-hour conversation, Tom, is critical, and I come back to the length of it for a specific reason. There's a lot of information changed. If you and I are trying to do a deal together, and we spend a good bit of time talking, maybe each one of us picks up information that makes it easier for us to get a deal, something we didn't know about the other side, so we didn't know about what they were interested in. And that is how you can sort of, maybe under certain circumstances, start to build a deal that otherwise might not have been available to you. That's what I think the White House is doing this morning. Whether or not you characterize it as a failure, as a success, the media will do more of that. If you're actually on the ground trying to get a deal done, you're looking as to whether or not you moved the ball in that direction last night. And my guess is they probably did at least just a little bit.
I mean, do you think the talks, direct conversation was perhaps a little hasty and perhaps more groundwork needed to be done before that? And so that when the two men did speak, they had a pretty clear idea of what was feasible, what was achievable? Because it seems, to a certain extent, like President Trump went in there with expectations right up here and he got something around here. I mean, is that a fair reading?
I think that's certainly the textbook approach to international affairs, right? Is you have the back channel conversations, the lower level conversations, and by the time the principals, the two people at the top of any bilateral conversation talk, that most of the details have at least been hammered out in principle. That's just not how Donald Trump works. Yes, there's always going to be a role for those back channel and lower level negotiations and discussions. My guess is those discussions went on before that call and are continuing today as you and I speak. But Donald Trump wants to talk to the principal himself. He believes in his own ability to get deals done. Certainly his life experience would say there's a good bit of evidence that he's right about that. So while that is what you've just described as textbook, sometimes you need to know when to throw the book out and do it your own way. And that's what Trump is probably doing.
Sure. And I mean, up until now, he's tended to regard President Zelensky as being the difficult party here. Do you think he's perhaps having a bit of a rethink? Do you think perhaps there is a bit of a rethink happening in the Trump administration about how to approach President Putin, for example?
If there's a rethink, I think it has to do with the relationship with Putin, not with Zelensky. I think they're pretty firm in their fact that they don't trust Zelensky. Look, there's a long history that isn't well known internationally. This is one of my frustrations, especially when I deal with my European friends, is that Ukraine has been and continues to be one of the most corrupt places on the face of the planet. We actually had special rules on the books here in the United States about dealing with Ukraine, even when it came to U.S. foreign aid. It is and was a very corrupt place, and that colors, I think, a lot of Trump's opinions about Zelensky and about Ukraine, generally speaking. I don't think that is going through a rethink here today. I think they might be doing exactly what you've just mentioned, which is looking at Putin and saying, you know what, maybe he wasn't as interested in peace as we thought that he was. Maybe he is interested in dragging this out longer than we thought he was. Maybe he is able to put his people through more deprivation than he has up to this point. And maybe we underestimated that. So yeah, again, at a 2-hour conversation, I hate to come back to the length, but a lot of information will exchange hands. So the U.S. team, the Trump team, has a lot more information available to them this morning than they did yesterday, and they might be using that to use your words, a little bit of a rethink of how to approach this.
Yeah, and we've got a result, actually, a proof of some of the fruit of that telephone conversation coming into us right now. Actually, it's being reported that Russia and Ukraine have exchanged 372 POWs. That's according to the Russian Defense Ministry. So that's a result, isn't it?
It is, and that's what you're looking for in that phone conversation is, okay, if we can't make progress on aid, if we can't make progress on total cessation of hostilities, where can we start? How do we crawl before we walk and then walk before we can run? So certainly information about the POWs it would be, again, what are you looking for? Positive momentum, and the POWs probably qualifies for that.
I just want to ask you, because you were telling us about what it's like to be in the room, presumably the Oval Office, I don't know, perhaps it isn't, when a call like that takes place between President Trump and, a high-level foreign leader like President Putin. Just talk us through who's in the room when that happens, and just tell us some details, anything you can remember from any similar calls that you sat in on, what sort of things?
Sure, it's not any great trade secrets or anything like that. On a call of that level, again, I have no information about the specific call. I wasn't there. I'm no longer in the White House. But a call of that level, I'd be curious, by the way, first and foremost, to know if the conversation took place in English. My guess is there were translators on both sides, and that is important, Tom. And we saw this with Zelensky. When Zelensky came into the White House a couple weeks ago in that famous or infamous face-to-face meeting with President Trump and Vice President Vance, he was speaking English. I think that was a mistake. He used a line where they asked him about the clothes that he was wearing, and he said, well, it's wartime. When the war is over, then maybe I will wear the costume again. In American English, that's almost an insult. Until you figure out that the word costume is the direct translation in Ukrainian language to suit, to what you are wearing right now. So there's that opportunity for a misinterpretation, or at least sort of a misunderstanding as to intention based upon translation from a different language. So I'm hopeful that at that meeting yesterday, they were not speaking English. Trump obviously doesn't speak Russian, but they were using translators. The translator would be there. Certainly the National Security Advisor, Mike Waltz, would be there. My guess is maybe the Secretary of State would be there as well, possibly even the Secretary of the Treasury, depending upon the issues they expected to come up. So this would be a very, very high level sort of conversation. The Chief of Staff would be there, and maybe 1 or 2 staffers as well, probably the press secretary, so that they can figure out what the messaging would be outward. So it's a fairly large crowd on the American side there in the Oval Office.
Yeah, you make a really good point about translators there, and that's something that I think a lot of people won't have thought of, and how those false friends, those words that don't quite translate the way you think they're going to translate, can actually give a totally wrong impression. I just want to ask you about your own experience of being in the Oval Office when a call like that happens. I mean, did you ever have situations in which President Trump was on a call and you sort of had to poke him or prod him or put the call on mute and just perhaps slip him a note and say, not so fast, Mr. President, or anything like that ever happen?
No, if there's any interaction between the president and the staff, first of all, he would solicit it. He might hit the silence button and ask for input. Staff doesn't tell the president they're doing something wrong. Typically what you would do, and that goes for every president, by the way, you would never do that in front of a foreign leader for sure. If you are slipping him notes, it's sort of to remind him that maybe there's 4 or 5 other things that we need to get to before the call is over, to remind him. He might say, now, remind me so I don't forget that we have to talk about X, Y, and Z, and you would do that. So there's some interaction between him and the staff. But let's face it, I mean, this is why you run for the job, right? This is poker at the very highest levels. The President of the United States, the President of Russia, it doesn't get any higher level than this. So the principle is really going to dominate the conversation, and that's the way it should be.
It's being reported that the two men talked about other things apart from Ukraine, some of them quite sort of light topics like ice hockey. And for some reason, that's been really picked up on by the Russian media. They seem to really like the fact that the two men talked about ice hockey. I mean, why do you think that was a winning topic of discussion?
Yeah, and our media has picked up on it as well, Tom. And again, I think this is part of the difficulty we face in when we get our news from media generally. And I'm not casting aspersions on any particular outlet, but media, that is plural for medium, which means you stand between two other things. There's a medium between you and the information. So there's a filter, and the filter right now, the media are talking about all these ordinary things. Look, you and I, before we were having this conversation, might have a conversation about 5 or 6 different things. Your suit, the weather here in Washington, D.C. It's how human beings communicate. So to think you're going to have a 2-hour conversation and maybe not talk about, I don't know, family, sports, the weather, something else they read in the news, that's how human beings communicate most of the time. I've never understood this this impression that just because people get elected to high office, they're somehow not human beings anymore. So no, it doesn't surprise me. I've been on 1,000 conversations with Trump, and I can tell you he likes the chit chat and the banter to talk about other things. Again, it's a good way to get information. You might learn something about somebody that you might otherwise not know. And maybe they talked about hockey, and maybe we end up with seeing a U.S. versus the Soviet Union, versus Russia hockey match or something like that from this, as the two countries try to rebuild a relationship after the war. I don't know, but I don't know why people are so surprised that in a conversation like that, they talked about things other than Ukraine.
Sure. So we might move on from ping pong diplomacy to ice hockey diplomacy, as you say.
It's a great way. I forgot all about it. That's exactly right.
It was a long time ago. Let's just wrap up by sort of looking forwards. I mean, clearly, most people that we've spoken to have characterized the fact that this dialogue is taking place as having been a positive thing. Dialogue is better than no dialogue. But what's the next step?
Action, something. And I'm just glad to hear the news you just told me. I'm hearing for the first time about the POW exchange. We'll see what happens in the next couple of days. I'll be curious to see how the Trump administration, if the reports about the Russian attacks on the Ukrainian energy infrastructure overnight after the agreement was struck are accurate. I'd be curious to see how the Trump team responds to that. I've not heard anything out of the White House yet here this morning, but that will be interesting to watch, because if there's an explanation, that's one thing. If there's no explanation, then you have to wonder, did you have a deal at all? So it will be interesting to see how they respond to the facts on the ground. But we'll look for the other details, how they play out. We'll also look for whether or not there's a follow-up discussion. If things go well, I would expect Donald Trump to have another call in the next several days with Putin as they try to build on any successes that they managed to have hammered out in yesterday's conversation. I'll also be curious to see how the outside world responds, most specifically European leaders and Ukraine, obviously, as to whether or not they consider this to be progress in the proper direction.
Just lastly, you are, of course, the former chief of staff to President Trump. Any parting words of advice that you would impart to the Trump presidency, the Trump administration, on how to deal with the Kremlin and how to perhaps make the next set of talks even more fruitful or more fruitful, depending on how you look at it, than the first lot?
Yeah, I've got a variety of opinions about the people that the president has chosen to put around him. I think he's got some really good people. I think he's got some subpar people. But the foreign policy team that he's got, the National Security Advisor, the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, I have a great deal of faith in. And I would tell him the same thing I would tell him if I was there is, Mr. President, your call. You're the boss. Your name was on the ballot. 80-some million people voted for you, but you do have a good team here. So listen to them. And my advice really, Tom, would be more to them than to him. And my advice to the staff is always the same, which is tell the president the truth. Don't tell the president what you think he wants to hear. Tell him the truth. And if you hear him say something that isn't right, need to figure out a way to get the right information. That's our job as staffers, to make sure the president has the best information possible. He makes the policy decisions. He makes the final decisions. It's our job to get him the information. So no, I wouldn't have much advice for the president. I'd have a good bit of advice for staff, but that's what the chief of staff does.
All right. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us. Always a pleasure. Mick Mulvaney, former chief of staff to President Donald Trump. Thanks again.
Thanks, Tom.
Well, let's get some more analysis. We can speak to Alexander Khara, who is a former Ukrainian diplomat, now CEO at the Center for Defense Strategies, who joins us now from Kyiv. Thank you so much for joining us once again here on Al Arabiya News. Those talks between President Trump and President Putin have been characterized as having been a success in Moscow. How are they viewed by Ukraine?
Well, certainly President Trump would describe them as a huge success for himself as well, but it's not that much that is success from our point of view. Let me start with two fundamentals that haven't been changed since these talks. First, Russia wants to subjugate Ukraine, destroy Ukrainian statehood. And Russia failed to do this militarily. That's why they are trying to exploit opportunities to achieve this goal by diplomatic means. And secondly, the United States view their strategic priorities somewhere else, not in Europe and neither in Ukraine. They believe that Russia may be instrumental in deterring China in the Indo-Pacific, Iran in the Middle East, and strengthen security of Israel. That's why for Mr. Trump, Ukraine doesn't matter, and he may try to exchange Ukraine for something that President Putin may offer. During our talks with Americans in Saudi Arabia, there was an agreement that we will go further with the comprehensive ceasefire. It means the ceasefire at air, on land, and at sea. Actually, Mr. Putin just rejected this notion. He proposed to have just one kind of ceasefire which benefits him more than anyone else. What I'm talking about? The Russians has been targeting Ukrainian energy infrastructure since the beginning of the reinvasion back in 2022. And certainly it's affect lives of ordinary Ukrainians. In return, Ukrainians are targeting oil refineries in Russia, which are providing gas and materials for their tanks and jets. Plus, they are getting hard currency out of the export of this commodity. Thus, they are fueling the war. So this type of agreement would secure Russia's energy sector, while Ukraine will be suffering from drone and missile strikes to its civilian infrastructure.
Okay.
And actually, there is a difference between the readouts of Mr. Trump and Mr. Putin. In Mr. Trump's document, they say about ceasefire on energy and infrastructure. While in Russian documents, they're talking about only energy infrastructure. And this means that the rest of the facilities may be targeted.
Okay.
And finally, there is another thing. We managed to fend off Russian Black Sea Fleet from our shores. And by doing this, we secured our sea lines of communication, and we were trading with the world, helping countries in need, and particularly suffered from food insecurity. And now the Russians want to have a sort of an agreement which would help them to hamper the Ukrainian trade with the outer markets. So that's why I don't think that it's beneficial for Ukraine.
Okay, I mean, some things have come out of this, and you can't ignore them. For example, the exchange of 372 prisoners, that's one outcome. And we understand that President Trump and President Zelensky are speaking right now, or this evening. I mean, things are happening, aren't they?
Well, yes, certainly. I didn't mention the prisoners for exchange, which certainly was the most important thing that happened, but it has been in preparation for weeks before, and it was not a result of the genius negotiation skills of Mr. Trump. Yes, President Zelensky is expected to talk to Mr. Trump to get some details out of this conversation, because, for example, there is another difference in reading of this meeting. The Russians are saying that the American assistance to Ukraine has been discussed, while Mr. Trump rejected that, and he said that they didn't even talk about it, which is a really important factor. This factor is a leverage against Ukraine, and that's why I believe that Mr. Zelensky will likely agree on these proposals, on this ceasefire, because we don't want to undermine our security, and once again to have this pause on security and intelligence assistance to Ukraine.
Doesn't sound like you've got much faith in President Trump's negotiating efforts. I mean, are you of the opinion that he shouldn't be talking to President Putin at all?
Oh, yes, I believe so. President Trump was saying that he will stand on the position of strength, and via strength he will get peace. But in reality, he has been exerting pressure over Ukraine only. There were no new sanctions against Russia. There were no criticism of the Russian conduct in this war or Putin himself, or vice versa. Our president and our country has been under the criticism from Mr. Trump and his colleagues. And if we are talking about the art of the deal, what kind of the art of the deal if you give up the two most important things beforehand? I mean, the idea that Ukraine will never join NATO, and the second thing that Ukraine will not be able to recover its international recognized borders. So I don't think that it's a type of negotiations that anyone expected from Mr. Trump. He's trying to cozy up with Putin for obvious reason. He needs a reset with Russia to get Russia on board from China, from Iran, from DPRK. And certainly to get some lucrative deals with Russia. Russia is a pretty rich country, and it will be happy to see sanctions being stripped from Russia and American money pouring into the Russian economy.
Okay, so if you don't think these negotiations are going to have the desired effect from Ukraine's point of view, how else can President Trump or how else can anyone achieve a lasting peace then?
I believe there is only one option, is to strengthen Ukraine, that we will be able to fend off Russians from our territory, either all territory captured since 2014 or some territory. And then when Putin realized that there is no possibility for him to get an advantage on the battlefield, that there is a long will of our European and American and other partners, and it means that he needs to sit around the table and discuss in good faith conditions of peace. But I don't believe that it's possible to have such an agreement with Mr. Putin because he believes he needs to subjugate Ukraine. He conducts a genocidal war against Ukraine. So there is no space for compromise.
We heard from the German Defense Minister, Boris Pistorius, saying President Putin is, quote, playing a game here, and I'm sure the American president won't be able to sit and watch for much longer. Do you think that, I mean, clearly the German defense minister thinks President Trump is going to have a change of heart and a change of opinion about his dealings with Mr. Putin. I mean, what do you think Boris Pistorius is getting at here?
Well, it's just a common sense because, you know, if you have a look at the history of the US-Russia relations since 1991, each and every American president wanted to start a new fresh start for relations with Russia, but inevitably they end up in worse relations that they can imagine. So it's the nature of Russia and the United States because they based on different values and they pursue a completely different opposite the strategic interests. Russia is a revisionist power. It wants to dominate in Europe, to be a hegemon. It wants to sit around the big table of big powers and divide the world and rule the fates of smaller nations. He wants to be respected for his nuclear power because, you know, if you're talking about economy, technology, culture, and many other fields, Russia is not on top of the list. So that's why I have no doubt that after a while, Trump will face the reality that Putin is not negotiable. It's not possible to agree on something except of shady deals or strategic corruption. And it's not in the interest of the United States to have such an ally. It's better to have Europe and some other allies, at least those who were with the United States since 1945. So I believe it's going to happen rather soon than later.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. We're out of time. Really appreciate you speaking to us once again on this channel. Alexander Khara, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Now, Israel has carried out fresh airstrikes in Gaza overnight, with health officials in Gaza saying that more than 430 Palestinians have been killed during the course of the last 2 days. Meanwhile, a UN building in Gaza is reported to have been hit during one airstrike, killing at least one UN worker and injuring several others. But the Israeli army is denying that it struck a UN building. Meanwhile, the White House says Israel consulted the US President Donald Trump's administration before carrying out these latest strikes. Well, there has been widespread condemnation from around the world, including from Egypt, which described these latest airstrikes as a blatant violation of the terms of the ceasefire. Well, more than 430 Palestinians, as we've been saying, have been killed since Israel resumed the bombardment of Gaza in the early hours of Tuesday. And the fresh strikes overnight were carried out by the Israeli military there in Gaza. Well, in a televised address, the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said that fresh strikes were, quote, just the beginning.
From now on, Israel will act against Hamas with increasing force, and from now on, negotiations will only take place under fire. Hamas has already felt the weight of our force in the last 24 hours, and I want to assure you and them, Hamas, this is only the beginning.
Well, let's get the latest now. We can speak to Juliette, who is the Director of Communications for UNRWA, who joins us now from the Jordanian capital, Amman. Juliette, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. We're hearing from the Health Ministry in Gaza that a foreign UN worker has been killed. 5 others have been seriously injured today in an Israeli strike on their headquarters. But Israel is denying this. Can you help us clarify the situation?
Look, we have had at least 2 colleagues killed today in Gaza. We are trying to figure out what exactly happened. What we do know is that this is yet another tragic incident for the UN. It's another black day for our organization. You see, since the war began, almost a year and a half ago, at UNRWA alone, we've had over 280 colleagues killed.
Indeed, and you use the language of black day. That's exactly the words being used by Philippe Lazzarini, who expressed his condolences and said that humanitarian workers must be protected at all times, he said in his latest tweet. I mean, when it comes to operating as a humanitarian worker in Gaza, I mean, just how dangerous is it? I mean, you've already mentioned the fact that so many people have been killed during this last year and a half or so. I mean, is anything done to protect them?
Gaza has become very, very fast one of the most dangerous places in the world for humanitarian workers. And if you look at the death toll, that speaks for itself, really. The loss has been huge for the United Nations. First and foremost, the dear colleagues that we continue to lose day in, day out. We've had a respite, obviously, during the ceasefire for a couple of months, but during wartime, we lose team members every single day. Just overnight, since the bombardment resumed in Gaza at UNRWA, we've lost an additional 3 colleagues at least. And this is what was accounted for, what we could verify. The numbers might be even higher. And of course, today with UNOPS and other United Nations agencies. Now, across the board in the Gaza Strip, United Nations facilities, buildings, installations, despite the fact that we share the coordinates with the Israeli authorities and other parties to the conflict, they have been hit at an unprecedented level, massive level. At UNRWA, as an example, 2/3 of our buildings have been hit, and we have 300 buildings at least across the war-torn enclave. So it's really been horrific for the United Nations. We continued, however, despite everything, serving the communities and undertaking our humanitarian commitment.
Yeah, you say that coordinates are shared, but there's a caveat, which is that a ban on UNRWA came into effect on the 30th of January. The Israeli authorities are forbidden, it would appear, from having any contact with UNRWA. Do you think herein lies the issue, that the fact that coordinates were not, there was a breakdown in communications because of this ban on UNRWA, or would you say this is totally unrelated?
So just to clarify, today's very tragic incident was not related to UNRWA. It was a United Nations Operation Service Office, UNOPS, which is a sister United Nations agency. Now, in general, we are a United Nations agency. The parties to the conflict, regardless of local bills or laws that may pass in local parliaments, parties to the conflict have got to respect the United Nations across the board, including UNRWA. Also, UNRWA is the largest humanitarian agency working in Gaza, whether it is the number of staff that serve with the agency, or it is the footprint that we have with, like I said, over 300 buildings. Parties to the conflict, whoever they are, must continue to respect the UN, including UNRWA.
And yet, until only an hour or two ago, Israel's line was, quote, contrary to reports, the IDF did not strike a UN compound in Deir al-Balah. And the fact they're saying that suggests perhaps they don't know what they struck. I mean, do you think it sounds like it was some sort of a miscalculation or an error on their part?
Look, that I really don't know. What I do know is that during the past year and a half, there's been so many violations, so many hits against the United Nations, so many thick red lines that have been crossed, including violations against the United Nations. And all of these violations must be investigated. All of the violators, all of those undertaking the violations must be held accountable.
So we're now back to a situation where we're seeing death tolls like we saw right at the beginning of the conflict. I mean, extremely high death toll we saw yesterday. What's your understanding of what the needs are and what the situation is on the ground for the people of Gaza?
Oh, we're absolutely fearing the worst. We're fearing that we will go back to the very bleak, horrific days in the first months of this brutal, brutal war. And the death toll that continues to be reported, that continues to increase, is the highest single daily death toll that has been recorded since the war began. The vast majority are believed to be women and children. That is absolutely horrific. And coupled with that is an almost total siege that the Israeli authorities continue to lay on the war-torn enclave in Gaza. No humanitarian assistance and no commercial supplies have gone into Gaza for more than 2 weeks now. If you recall, at the beginning of the war, we had a very similar situation when everything was banned from entering into Gaza, and the consequences of those first 2 weeks of very hermetic siege on the Gaza Strip continued to be felt for months on end. So what we call for is for the resumption of the ceasefire, to go back to that so that the bombardment stops, so the killing of civilians stop, for the renewal of deliveries of humanitarian assistance and also commercial supplies, and for the release of all hostages who are in Gaza, and the release of more Palestinian detainees in line with the agreement that was reached a couple of months ago.
And the fact that no humanitarian aid has been allowed in to Gaza for several days now, what does that mean for organizations like yours and for other NGOs on the ground? You know, are there warehouses, are there depots completely empty now when it comes to food supplies, medicine supplies, fresh water?
It's been more than 2 weeks now, and for an area that depends entirely on handouts, that's an absolute catastrophe, because during the ceasefire, we were getting in hundreds of trucks of supplies every day, and we managed to replenish and we managed to distribute. But it shows that the dependence on humanitarian handouts by the people of Gaza is very, very high. And so every day when there is no aid, that makes a huge difference. Hence why we've got to go back to the resumption of aid deliveries into Gaza. Otherwise, we are going to go back to where we were in the beginning, to the levels of hunger that we've all witnessed, these horrific scenes of babies dying of malnutrition and people dying of dehydration and lack of medical supplies and medical care. The world cannot afford to repeat that tragedy. And what needs to happen is a resumption of the ceasefire, but also it is time for courageous leadership, including in the international community, to bring the sides together towards a peaceful solution to this very, very long and very painful conflict.
So what is your message to the international community, and who would you like to see doing what?
Well, look, several messages. First and foremost is to do whatever possible so that the killing stops of civilians, of women, children, but also of ordinary men, right? I mean, the killing of civilians in Gaza must come to an end. The displacement, the horror must come to an end. There has to be more done by those countries who have influence on the two parties to the conflict, so that the nightmare that the people of Gaza, the people of Israel have lived through since the 7th of October 2023, that is not repeated, that we are at a place where there is a ceasefire, a long-term ceasefire, and then much, much more needs to be done to once and for all address the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and reach a peaceful diplomatic solution.
And when we read tweets like the one put out by the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres saying, quote, "I'm outraged by the Israeli airstrikes in Gaza. I strongly appeal for a ceasefire to be respected and for humanitarian assistance to be re-established." I mean, do you see him being able to change something with words like that? I mean, who's he appealing to?
He's appealing to anyone who has influence over parties to the conflict. He is our top messenger of peace. He is calling for peace. This is one of the areas that we work in and on in the United Nations, is to bring the sides together towards peace. Peace is long overdue in this current context. I mean, you see, it's been 8 decades of fighting, of renewed cycles of violence, of grief, of loss, of despair. And it is safe to say that since the 7th of October 2023, it's been the worst for people in that area. And so it is time. It is also time for courage, and courage to reach an end to this bloody conflict once and for all in a peaceful, diplomatic way.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed for your time. Juliette Touma, Director of Communications for UNRWA, thank you very much for taking the time to speak to us. Now, after 9 months stranded in space, 2 NASA astronauts, Butch Wilmore and Sonny Williams, have finally returned to planet Earth. Well, their SpaceX capsule made a fast and fiery re-entry through the Earth's atmosphere before 4 parachutes opened up ahead of splashdown off the coast of Florida. Well, this concludes a mission that was supposed to last for just 8 days, but it was dramatically extended after the spacecraft suffered technical problems. Well, earlier on this month, President Trump took a swipe at his predecessor, former President Joe Biden, and accused him of forgetting about Wilmore and Williams. And he made a pledge that Elon Musk and SpaceX would be involved in returning them home. Well, on a lighter note, President Trump appeared to speculate that the two NASA astronauts could perhaps have fallen in love after spending 9 months together out in space.
You know, we have two people up there that Biden and Kamala left up there. We're coming up to get you. I've authorized Elon. I said, can you get them out? Because, you know, they've been left up there. I hope they like each other, but maybe they'll love each other. I don't know.
Well, let's get more now. We can speak to Scott Kidd Poteet, a spacecraft pilot of the Polaris Dawn mission in 2024. That's a privately funded human spaceflight that was operated by SpaceX. Scott, or Kidd, don't know which to call you, joins us from New Hampshire in the United States. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us. Let's talk about splashdown just off the Florida coast last night. Those two NASA astronauts back on planet Earth. What do you think went through their minds as they reached this planet?
So they were up there for 286 days, which is a long time because living in space, it's an austere environment, and there's many challenges you got to overcome. But the beautiful thing about the human body, it adapts to its environment, which also means it's challenging once you get back to gravity, because our bodies are built for 1G. And as far as what they experience on the reentry, you know, it's a several hours process, procedures to get prepared for it. But then they'll do what's called a deorbit burn to slow the vehicle down, so gravity can pull it back into the atmosphere, because it's traveling 17,500 miles an hour, and you got to slow down. And to slow down, it requires, you know, the impact of the atmosphere to drag it down to about 350 miles an hour before they can deploy the drogue chutes, followed by the main parachutes. And then that process is roughly about 10 minutes. It's a pretty intense ride because of the G forces. It's about 4.5 Gs you experience on the way down, which when you haven't experienced Gs for 9 months, it's pretty impactful. And then, you know, it's a gentle splashdown off the coast of Florida in the Gulf of America.
Yeah, they're probably pretty relieved to be back on, well, sort of terra firma, although to begin with it was indeed the sea. And of course, the craft that they were on would have reached some pretty high temperatures during that 17-hour-long journey back to planet Earth. I just want to ask you, though, as someone who's experienced zero gravity before, I mean, what does it do to the human body? You've experienced it for a couple of days. These people, as we were saying, experienced it for 286 days. I mean, what happens to the human body under those sorts of conditions?
Yes. So, you know, when you talk about the launch process, once you get to orbit, again, it takes about 9 to 10 minutes to get to space, and you experience these G forces, very similar to a roller coaster, even an airliner, that centrifugal force pushing on your body. But once you get to orbit, you transition immediately to microgravity, zero gravity. And it's this transition your body goes through. And the first thing you really experience is this fluid shift, because again, you're used to gravity pulling on the fluid in your body, but now it just kind of shifts up. Your organs are moving around, and this cognitive shift happens in your brain. And so it's just, you're forced to adapt to this new environment. There's also something called space adaptation syndrome that can impact up to 50% of astronauts. It's that space motion sickness disorientation. But after a while, you adapt and you become accustomed, especially after a couple days, weeks, months. You know, that's your new environment. You got to stay fit. So that's why they dedicate 2 to 3 hours a day to try to preserve as much fitness as they possibly can. But once you adapt, it's a pretty comfortable environment in microgravity.
Sure. I mean, okay, they're going to be under physical supervision, these two astronauts, for quite a while because of the physical aspects of what their journey and their long mission in space has done to their bodies. What about the mind? What does all of this do? I mean, you touched on it briefly there, but from a mental health point of view, I mean, what sort of effect does space travel and that sort of length of stay away from planet Earth do to your mind?
Tom, that's a great point you bring up. And, you know, like I talked about that initial transition, they call it a cognitive shift. It's this overview effect experience that you have looking at planet Earth from such a high altitude. And it's this paradigm you kind of got to get used to, because you're in this very sterile environment in a capsule, and you're just staring at this beautiful radiant planet. But if you're going to be up there for several months, and when we talk about going back to the lunar surface and eventually Mars and beyond, these missions are just going to get longer and longer and longer. And you have to figure out how to deal with the isolation. You're away from your families who are making big sacrifices while you fulfill this obligation and mission. And so we have to address those concerns. That we're going to experience some type of, depression, isolation. And that's why they dedicate so many hours to the science and research. I mean, we had 40 experiments on our 5-day mission. Butch and Sonny, they participated in over 900 hours of science and research while they were on orbit. Or I believe 500 hours. I can't remember the number, but it was a substantial amount of time dedicated to experiments that address those concerns about those long duration missions.
Yeah, I don't have the number of hours, but I'm told they worked on some 150 different scientific experiments while they were up there. And what's your understanding as to why what was supposed to be a few days long mission turned into this 286-day ordeal? What went wrong?
Well, what went wrong was some issues with the Starliner, the Boeing vehicle that took them to the ISS. As far as the decision behind closed doors in the Oval Office, I wasn't privy to any of those conversations. There's numerous options that and resources available that SpaceX was prepared to execute on if given the opportunity. But the higher that be made the decisions that they did, and they stayed up there for 9 months. And I think, if anything, it's just a testament to the resilience of Butch and Sonny to be able to endure those 9.5 months. It's just a demonstration of their professionalism to be able to execute the mission. It's, for me, with a military background, deployments to Afghanistan and Iraq, it was, you have a set schedule, but there's always slips. And you have to be able to deal with those circumstances. And it's not only us, it's our families back home as well. But they did a professional job, and we should all be just celebrating the enormous accomplishments of SpaceX and Elon and President Trump.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, President Trump and Elon Musk suggested perhaps that their plight had somehow been the fault of President Biden, the former president of the United States. I mean, I know you say you weren't privy to all the conversations, but is any of that justified in your opinion?
I think they did the right thing by bringing them home as soon as they possibly could when they had the power to make those decisions. And it's just a huge celebration. Watching the broadcast, it brought back a lot of memories. Very short 6 months ago was when we were in space. And to see the vehicle and the beautiful imagery that SpaceX provided on the webcast was just phenomenal. And to top it all off, they got dolphins, swimming around the capsule in the water. We didn't have dolphins, not that I can recall, because our splashdown was at night. But it's just a huge celebration, and we should honor Butch and Sonny for their accomplishments.
Yeah, I mean, they're veteran astronauts, aren't they? Butch Wilmore and Sonny Williams. And I don't know if you know either of them. Perhaps you do. Perhaps you've met them and had some interactions with them. President Trump sort of did a bit of speculating on the dynamic between the two of them. Wonder whether you heard that speculation and what you made of it.
I'm not sure what speculation you're referring to. If you can provide a little more color, maybe I can.
Well, there was a bit of a suggestion that perhaps, they might have had a romantic connection of some sort, being stranded on a spaceship for 9 months, out in space for 9 months. I mean, what do you make of that kind of speculation?
Oh, that sounds like a speculation to me. I mean, they're the utmost professionals. I've only been acquainted to them. It's a tight community. the astronauts, and they have a annual reunion. And they're nothing but the utmost professionals as far as my interaction is concerned.
Okay, that wasn't my speculation, just to be clear. That was the president who suggested that perhaps there'd been a little bit of a romantic interlude. Just lastly, I mean, I want to ask you about your own experience in space. And, you know, it's not often that we get to speak to someone who's experienced zero gravity. Kid, what did you do? What did you first do when you got into that state of zero gravity? What was the first thing you wanted to try out? And what did you find perhaps personally most surprising about floating around and being zero gravity yourself?
Well, you know, I flew fighter jets, F-16s for 20 years. And so I'm used to that adrenaline, but this was like nothing I've ever experienced. I mean, it's 1.7 million pounds of thrust. That's the equivalent of 70 F-16s, the aircraft that I flew. And, you know, it's just a pretty violent ride to get to space. But once the separation happens between the first booster, the second booster, you're in orbit. And you're floating, it's just this overwhelming sensation of sensory overload, especially when you get to see the planet, because it's just something we're just not used to seeing. You know, the light is filtered through the atmosphere when we look up from the planet. Looking down, it's just this constant evolving because you're traveling 17,500 miles an hour and you're seeing sunrises and sunsets every 90 minutes, every hour and a half. So it's just this beautiful, beautiful view. And the microgravity, it's, you know, you're constantly overcorrecting. So you want to move around the capsule and you just start bouncing off walls because you're overcompensating. So it's almost like this meditative state you got to get into to be able to perfect that whole floating in space. But I wish more people could experience it. And I know that's the direction we're heading. With the space economy and all these companies that are participating in this newest chapter of the final frontier, it's truly exciting, and I was just excited to be a part of it.
Major Tom to Kid Poteet. I mean, what you just said there sounded a lot like the lyrics of a very famous song.
Use that one, haven't you?
There was a lot of what you said that sounded like the lyrics to a very much loved David Bowie track. Just lastly, sorry, we've got 30 more seconds left of this interview, but I mean, what did you try out what was the first thing you tried when you were experiencing that sort of sensation of having zero gravity around you?
Yeah, well, I was fortunate not to experience the whole space adaptation, the motion sickness. So I just started doing the tumbles, you know, spinning around, and because the capsule is rotating as well. So you look outside, you see the horizon. All right, that makes sense. A couple minutes go by and it's completely opposite. So you're trying to get used to this, you know, top and bottom, and it can be very disorienting, but I was just spinning away.
It sounds like a lot of fun. Well, thank you so much. We really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us. Scott Kid Poteet, thank you very much indeed for your time.
Thank you, Tom.
Well, that is all we have time for Global News today. Be sure to join us again tomorrow for more exclusive interviews. Until then, bye-bye.